It was a cool, quiet morning in a small town where everyone knew each other by name. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a gentle glow over the town's main street. Shops were opening up, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air as people shuffled in and out of the local cafe, getting their morning caffeine fix before the day fully began. Among them was Judge Amelia Blackwell, a name not everyone knew, but one that held great respect in courtrooms across the county. Amelia was dressed simply, wearing a soft sweater and jeans, with her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She didn't look like the type of person who held such power or respect. She looked like anyone else, a neighbor, maybe a friend, just a regular person grabbing her morning coffee. The people around her saw a friendly, approachable woman who always greeted others with a warm smile. Little did they know, this was a woman who had the authority to decide people's fates in a courtroom. As she walked through the bustling cafe, nodding politely to familiar faces, Amelia was happy to blend in. She enjoyed these quiet moments of anonymity where she could observe the world around her without drawing attention. But today, her peaceful morning was about to take a turn she hadn't expected. Today, she would be seen as just another person. No title, no robe, just Amelia. And today, that was going to be a problem. Officer Jack Monroe was patrolling the town's main street, keeping a sharp eye on everyone passing by. Jack was known for his tough, no-nonsense attitude, and his quick judgments, often based more on assumptions than facts. He looked at people and decided who they were in an instant, and once his mind was made up, it was hard to change. Today, as he watched the morning crowd, his gaze fell on Amelia. To Jack, she was no judge, no authority figure, just another person who didn't quite belong, someone who looked out of place to him. The badge on his chest made him feel powerful, as though he had the right to judge people's character at a glance. And to him, Amelia was someone who needed to be put in her place. Amelia, sensing his eyes on her, looked up and caught his stare. She'd seen that look before, the kind that judged without knowing, the kind that assumed without asking. She'd seen it in court, with witnesses and even defendants, people who felt they were being seen through a lens of prejudice. But today, she was the one under that judgmental gaze, and it sent a chill down her spine. She gave a small nod, hoping he would move on. But Jack was already approaching her, his stance firm, his face set. Amelia took a slow breath, sensing that her quiet morning was about to become anything but peaceful. She dealt with people like him in her courtroom, men who assumed they knew who people were without knowing their stories. But she hadn't expected to face this here, in her own town, as she tried to enjoy a simple coffee. Little did Officer Monroe know, he wasn't just looking at a regular person. Today, he was about to meet Judge Amelia Blackwell, a woman who held far more power and resilience than he could ever imagine. Yet, in that moment, he saw her only as someone to question, someone he had power over. And Amelia, she just watched, waiting for him to make his move, aware that today was going to be a day neither of them would forget. Officer Jack Monroe walked down the street with a firm, almost aggressive stride, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. He was known for his strict demeanor, and his sharp gaze often made people feel uneasy. Jack liked things to be in order, and he had a way of judging people quickly, sizing them up based on his own assumptions. Today, as he looked around the small town he knew so well, his attention was drawn to a woman standing outside the cafe, sipping her coffee and looking entirely relaxed. Amelia Blackwell looked ordinary to anyone passing by, just a woman enjoying her morning drink. But to Jack, there was something off about her. She didn't look familiar, and to him, that was enough to warrant suspicion. Maybe it was the way she seemed too comfortable, too calm in a place he felt was his to protect. Without a second thought, Jack decided she didn't belong. As he approached her, Amelia noticed him coming but remained still, keeping her eyes on her coffee cup. She could sense the judgment in his stare. It wasn't the first time she'd felt someone look at her this way, and sadly, she knew it wouldn't be the last. But Amelia stayed calm, letting him make the first move. Jack stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms and looking her up and down with a critical eye. "Ma'am, I don't think I've seen you around here before. What brings you to this part of town?" His voice was cold, his words more of an accusation than a friendly question. Amelia looked up, meeting his stare. "I come here often," she replied softly, not giving him more information than necessary. Her tone was calm, and she didn't let his harsh attitude shake her. She dealt with people like Jack before, people who used their position to belittle others, people who thought their authority gave them the right to judge without knowing a thing about the person in front of them. But Jack wasn't satisfied. Her calm response seemed to irritate him. He took a step closer, his gaze hardening. "Do you have ID on you?" he asked, his tone demanding now. To him, her simple answer sounded like defiance, and he wasn't going to let that slide. He assumed she was trying to avoid his questions, to hide something. Amelia, however, remained steady, reaching slowly into her bag to pull out her ID. She handed it to him without a word, her face expressionless. Jack took it, barely glancing at the name, focusing instead on her face, as if he could read her intentions just by looking at her. To him, she was just another person who needed to be reminded of her place. Jack's questions continued, each one sounding more accusatory. "Are you here to meet someone? Do you work around here?" His words carried a weight of suspicion, but Amelia stayed quiet, letting him talk. Each question was a display of his authority, an attempt to show her who was in control. But Jack couldn't see what was right in front of him. A woman who was not intimidated, a woman who had spent her career dealing with people just like him. Little did he know, he was talking down to someone with far more authority than he could imagine. But Amelia didn't reveal it, not yet. She wanted to see how far he would go, how much arrogance he would display before realizing his mistake. This was her town, her community, but Jack saw her as an outsider, someone he needed to put in her place. He finally handed her ID back, giving her one last condescending look. "Just keep in mind, Mom, we keep a close eye on things here. Don't cause any trouble." His tone was full of self-importance, as if he were offering her a favor by letting her be there. Amelia took her ID back calmly, offering him a small, polite nod. Inside, she was holding back a sense of amusement, knowing the truth that he had missed entirely. She hadn't broken eye contact with him once, meeting his cold gaze with a quiet strength that he couldn't understand. Jack, however, still believed he had put her in her place. To him, this was just another interaction, another reminder of his authority. But for Amelia, it was something more. It was a test, a small example of the prejudice she knew all too well. She'd seen people make snap judgments about her before, and she'd faced them with the same calm resolve. Today, though, this little encounter was just beginning. Jack Monroe had no idea that the woman he thought he could intimidate was actually Judge Amelia Blackwell, someone who could decide his fate if she wanted to. But for now, she kept that to herself, letting him believe he was in charge. After all, sometimes the greatest power lies in patience, in waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. And Jack's moment was coming. Officer Monroe wasn't finished yet. He continued to press Amelia with question after question, each one carrying a tone of suspicion. To him, she was someone out of place, someone who needed to be watched closely. His questions were sharp and cold, cutting into her morning peace with every word. "So, do you live around here?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he watched her closely, waiting for any sign of hesitation. Amelia, calm as ever, gave him a simple nod. "Yes, I've lived here for quite some time." Her voice was steady, giving nothing away. But Monroe's face twisted slightly, as though her calmness somehow irritated him. "What do you do for a living?" he shot back, his tone harsh. To him, she couldn't possibly hold any position of importance. His assumptions about her were clear in every word he spoke, every look he gave her. He wasn't just questioning her, he was judging her, trying to fit her into the narrow box he had in his mind. Amelia paused for a moment, her eyes calmly meeting his. "I work with the community," she replied, her answer purposefully vague. She could have told him everything, ended his little game right there. But instead, she chose to let him continue, watching as he made one assumption after another. Monroe sneered, clearly unimpressed. "Community work, huh? Well, just make sure you're not causing any trouble," he said, a hint of warning in his voice. To him, community work probably meant something small, something unimportant. He couldn't see past his own prejudice to realize he was talking to a respected judge, a woman with the power to make decisions that could affect his life. But Amelia held her silence, waiting, letting him feel in control. She watched him carefully, noting every sneer, every dismissive glance. She could see his arrogance, how he believed he held all the power in this moment. Each question he asked seemed to reveal more about him than it did about her. His prejudice was on full display, and he didn't even realize it. He saw her only through his assumptions, blinded by his own arrogance. "So, who do you know in this area?" he asked, as if trying to catch her in some lie. Amelia smiled softly, her expression calm. "I know quite a few people," she answered. That was true. She knew many people in town, from the mayor to the local business owners. But again, she kept her answer simple, letting him fill in the blanks with his own assumptions. Monroe scoffed, shaking his head. He looked at her as if she were an inconvenience, as if he had better things to do. "Well, just don't go hanging around where you're not wanted," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. His words were full of assumptions, of prejudice he couldn't even hide. To him, she was just another face in the crowd, someone he could talk down to without consequence. Amelia held back a sigh, her patience unwavering. She knew she could reveal her position at any moment, put him in his place with a single sentence. But she chose to wait, to let him continue digging himself deeper. Each word he spoke, each sneer, was a small revelation of his character. He believed he was in control, that he held the authority in this interaction. Little did he know, he was speaking to someone with far more authority than he could imagine. As Monroe continued, he became bolder, his words carrying more and more arrogance. "People need to respect the rules around here," he said, as if lecturing her. Amelia raised an eyebrow, watching him with quiet amusement. Here he was, talking down to her, explaining rules and respect to a woman who spent every day upholding the law in her courtroom. It was almost laughable, the way he saw himself as the authority in this moment. Amelia noticed everything. The way he held himself, the tone of his voice, the sneer in his eyes. She could see the prejudice in his gaze, the way he judged her based on nothing more than his assumptions. He believed he was teaching her a lesson, that he was showing her her place. But with each word, he was only digging himself into a deeper hole. Finally, after what felt like an endless stream of questions and thinly veiled insults, Monroe seemed satisfied. He gave her one last look, full of the same arrogance he'd shown from the start. To him, this was just another routine interaction, another person he had put in their place. But for Amelia, it was a perfect example of the prejudice she saw all too often. As he turned to leave, Amelia allowed herself a small smile, knowing that his confidence would soon be shattered. She had watched and listened, taking in every slight, every sneer, and she knew that the moment of truth was coming. Monroe had no idea who he had been talking down to, but soon he would. And Amelia would be right there, calm and composed, ready to reveal the truth. Officer Jack Monroe had reached his limit. He felt that this woman, who was far too calm and composed for his liking, was somehow challenging his authority. To him, she didn't look like she belonged here, and the way she kept her answers brief only frustrated him further. He decided she was hiding something, and in his mind, that meant she was trouble. Monroe felt the need to show her who was in charge. Amelia stood there, still as calm as ever, watching him with a patient gaze. She knew exactly where this was headed but chose not to stop him. She had given him every chance to back down, to realize he was making a mistake, but he was too blinded by his own arrogance to see it. Jack looked her up and down one last time, then reached for his handcuffs, feeling the thrill of what he thought was his rightful authority. "All right, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with forced politeness, the kind that carried a clear threat beneath it. "You're under arrest for obstructing an officer." He almost smirked, certain he was in the right. This woman, standing here with her quiet confidence, had finally given him a reason to assert his power. Amelia raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting for him to take the next step. Jack grabbed her arm, pulling it roughly to the side, and she felt the cold metal of the cuffs press against her wrist. But before he could snap them closed, she calmly reached into her bag with her free hand and pulled out her ID. She held it up right in front of him, her expression composed but firm. "Officer Monroe," she said softly, yet with a strength that made him pause, "you're about to arrest a judge." At first, he looked at her in confusion, his brain struggling to catch up. He glanced at the ID she held, barely processing the words printed on it. But slowly, the reality began to sink in. His eyes widened, and his face drained of color as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The cuffs slipped from his fingers, falling to the ground with a loud clatter that seemed to echo in the quiet street. His confidence, his arrogance, all of it vanished in an instant. "Abe, a judge," he stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. He looked from her face to the ID and back again, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to form words. I didn't know. I mean." Amelia kept her gaze steady, letting him feel the weight of his mistake. She could see the panic in his eyes, the way his mind was racing to understand what had just happened. The authority he thought he had over her had vanished completely, leaving him feeling small and exposed. "Yes, I am Judge Amelia Blackwell," she said, her voice firm but calm. "And you just tried to arrest me because of your own assumptions. You never bothered to ask who I was. You never took a moment to consider that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the person you assumed I was." Jack's face was now a mix of fear and shame. He looked down at the ground, unable to meet her eyes. The confidence he had displayed moments ago was gone, replaced by a nervous silence. He shifted his feet, his hands fidgeting as if he didn't know what to do with them. The realization of his actions, of how he had treated a judge, weighed heavily on him. "Judge Blackwell, I'm so sorry," he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize." Amelia held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "It's not just about who I am, Officer Monroe," she said, her tone carrying a quiet strength. "It's about how you chose to see me, how quickly you judged me without knowing anything about me. You treated me as if I were a threat, as if I didn't belong. And why? Because I didn't look the way you expected." He nodded slowly, unable to deny the truth. He felt a deep shame creeping over him, a realization that he had let his own biases dictate his actions. In his mind, he'd been so sure of himself, so certain that he was right. Now, standing in front of her, he felt like a fool. Amelia continued, her voice unwavering. "Do you know how many people come through my courtroom who feel exactly the way I felt today? People who are judged before they even have a chance to speak. People who are treated as guilty just because of how they look or where they come from." Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. He'd heard people talk about prejudice, about judging others unfairly, but he had never really thought about it until now. And now, standing before the very person he had judged, he felt the full weight of what he had done. "I'm truly sorry, Judge Blackwell," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I wasn't thinking." Amelia gave him a long, steady look. "You weren't thinking," she repeated, her tone firm but not unkind. "And that's the problem. Officer Monroe, you acted without thought, without consideration. This is the same mistake I see too often. A rush to judgment, a failure to see the person standing in front of you." Jack's shoulders slumped, and he took a step back, as though trying to distance himself from his own actions. He felt like the world had shifted beneath him, leaving him with nothing to hold on to. The authority he had always taken for granted now felt hollow, as if he'd been stripped of something essential. Amelia looked at him, a mixture of disappointment and understanding in her gaze. We all have a responsibility to see people for who they are, not for who we assume them to be, she said softly. That's especially true for people in positions of power. Jack nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He felt a deep shame that he couldn't shake, a realization that he had let his own prejudices control his actions. The image of himself as a protector, as someone who upheld the law, had been shattered in that moment. Instead, he saw himself as she saw him, a man who had judged without understanding, who had wielded his authority without care. Amelia finally let out a soft sigh. "Officer Monroe," she said, her voice gentler now, "I'm not here to ruin your career. But I do hope this is a lesson you'll remember. Because this isn't just about me. It's about every person you interact with from now on." Jack looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "Thank you, Judge Blackwell. I promise I'll remember this. I'll make sure I don't make this mistake again." Amelia gave him a small nod, a hint of understanding in her expression. She could see that he was genuinely sorry, that he understood the gravity of what he had done. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but perhaps this moment, this experience, would plant a seed. "Good," she replied simply. "That's all I ask." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jack standing there, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. He watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and shame. He knew that he would never forget this day, that it would stay with him as a reminder of the power he held and the responsibility that came with it. As Amelia disappeared into the crowd, Jack took a deep breath, letting the weight of his mistake settle in fully. He knew he had a long way to go, a lot to learn, but for the first time, he felt ready to face that challenge. And as he stood there, the cuffs still lying on the ground, he realized that sometimes the greatest lessons come from the moments that break us down, forcing us to rebuild ourselves with a deeper understanding of who we truly are. The news spread fast. By midday, nearly everyone in town had heard about what had happened between Officer Monroe and Judge Amelia Blackwell. People were whispering in the streets, talking about how the officer had tried to arrest the judge based on nothing more than his own assumptions. Some were shocked. Others were not surprised at all, knowing Monroe's history of quick judgments and rough handling of people he deemed suspicious. For the first time, the officer who usually walked around with a sense of power and control was the one under scrutiny. His mistake was too big to ignore. The police department received calls from concerned residents who wanted to know if the town would let this sort of behavior slide. People were upset, questioning how someone in Monroe's position could act this way. And Judge Amelia Blackwell was right there, overseeing every step of the investigation. Amelia didn't want to make a public spectacle, but she understood that this was an important moment for the town. She was not only a judge, she was a member of this community, and it was her duty to ensure justice, even if it meant holding someone in authority accountable. This wasn't just about Officer Monroe. It was about setting a standard, making it clear that everyone, regardless of their position, had to treat others with respect and fairness. The police department took the matter seriously. They began their investigation, looking into Monroe's actions that morning and even reviewing past complaints from other residents. Amelia stayed involved, observing the process to ensure that it was thorough and unbiased. She didn't want Monroe to be unfairly punished, but she also knew that his actions couldn't go without consequence. She wanted him, and others in the department, to understand that power came with responsibility, and that mistreatment and prejudice had no place in this town. After a few days of investigation, the department made its decision. Officer Monroe was put on suspension, with mandatory training to address his behavior and improve his understanding of bias and respectful treatment. He would also have to undergo regular reviews to ensure he was meeting the standards expected of him. Amelia watched as he was escorted out of the department, his head lowered, his usual air of arrogance gone. This was a humbling moment for him, and she hoped he would learn from it. Standing outside the police department, Amelia spoke to the officers and a few town members who had gathered. Her voice was firm and clear as she addressed them. This town is a place where everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. There is no room for prejudice here. We must hold each other accountable, not just for the sake of justice, but for the sake of our community. Her words carried a weight that everyone felt. The officers understood that their roles were not just about enforcing laws, but also about setting an example. The townspeople nodded in agreement, feeling reassured by her leadership. They knew that with Amelia overseeing things, they could trust that fairness and respect would be upheld. As Amelia walked away, she felt a sense of fulfillment. Justice had been served, but more than that, a message had been sent. This wasn't just a lesson for Officer Monroe. It was a reminder to the entire community. Respect and dignity were values that everyone deserved, and it was up to each person, especially those in positions of power, to uphold those values. With Monroe's suspension and the new standards being set, Amelia hoped the department would become more mindful in the future. This incident, though painful for some, was a chance for growth, a chance to make the town a better, fairer place for all its residents. She knew there was still work to be done, but she felt confident that, together, they were on the right path. As the day drew to a close, Judge Amelia Blackwell stood on the courthouse steps, watching the sky shift from soft pinks to deep purples, the sun slowly sinking below the horizon. The courthouse, usually bustling with people hurrying in and out, was quiet now, almost peaceful. Amelia took a deep breath, letting the calm of the evening settle over her. Today had been a significant day, not just for her but for the entire town. She could still hear whispers of conversations, still see the concerned faces of people who had approached her to ask about Officer Monroe and what would happen next. She knew this day would leave a mark, a reminder of how deeply judgment could hurt and how important justice truly was. Amelia's thoughts wandered back to the morning's events. She could still feel the weight of Officer Monroe's stare, the assumptions he had made in an instant, without knowing anything about her. It had been tempting to reveal who she was right away, to stop his behavior in its tracks with a single word. But she had chosen a different path, one that required patience and quiet strength. In that moment, she had wanted him to see his own actions clearly, to feel the consequences of judging another person unfairly. Her patience had allowed him to reveal his own biases, and by doing so, he had set himself on a path that led to a humbling lesson. She hadn't needed to argue or raise her voice. Instead, she had let the truth unfold, knowing it would speak louder than any words. As she watched the colors of the sky deepen, Amelia felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The actions taken by the police department and the support shown by the community were steps forward. The townspeople had come together, united in their desire for fairness and justice. They had seen the harm caused by prejudice, and they were ready to hold themselves and others accountable. In many ways, today's events had become a lesson for everyone, a chance to reflect on the importance of treating people with dignity and respect. Amelia felt proud of her town, proud that they were willing to face uncomfortable truths and make the changes needed to move forward. The courthouse, with its tall columns and sturdy doors, stood as a symbol of justice, a place where people came seeking fairness and resolution. To Amelia, it was more than just a building. It was a reminder of her responsibility, a place where she could help bring balance and order to her community. But she knew that justice wasn't confined to the walls of a courthouse. True justice was something that had to be practiced daily, in every interaction, every decision. It was about seeing beyond assumptions, looking past appearances, and understanding the humanity in each person. Today had been a test of that belief, a reminder that justice wasn't just a job for her. It was a calling, a commitment to make her town a place where everyone felt safe and valued. As the last light of the sun slipped away, Amelia thought about the strength it took to remain calm in the face of prejudice. She thought of the people she saw in her courtroom, those who came in carrying their own stories, their own struggles. Some of them were treated unfairly, judged before they even had a chance to speak. Today, she had been in their place, feeling the weight of judgment, the sting of assumptions. It had been a reminder of the experiences others faced, and it strengthened her resolve to be a fair and compassionate judge. Her role wasn't just to hand down sentences, but to listen, to understand, to see beyond the surface. People often mistook quietness for weakness, assuming that strength had to be loud, that power had to come with force. But Amelia knew better. Her strength came from patience, from a willingness to observe, to wait for the right moment. She didn't need to shout to be heard. Her actions, her integrity, spoke louder than any words ever could. Today, she had shown Officer Monroe and the rest of the town that real power wasn't about authority or status. True power lay in understanding, in giving others the space to see their own mistakes and learn from them. It lay in standing firm in one's values, even when others doubted or underestimated them. The town had learned something valuable today, a lesson that would stay with them. They had seen what happens when prejudice goes unchecked, when judgment is passed without understanding. And they had also seen the strength of humility, the courage it took to admit a mistake and work toward change. Officer Monroe's actions had sparked a conversation, one that Amelia hoped would lead to a more compassionate community. She knew there was still work to be done, that biases wouldn't disappear overnight. But she also believed that moments like these, moments of reckoning and reflection, could spark real growth. Standing there, Amelia felt a deep sense of purpose. She knew that her role as a judge wasn't just about making rulings or interpreting laws. It was about shaping her community, guiding it toward a place of understanding and respect. She had a responsibility to set an example, to show people that everyone deserved to be seen and heard. She wanted her town to be a place where people felt safe, where they knew they would be treated fairly, regardless of who they were or where they came from. As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Amelia allowed herself a small smile. She had faced challenges before, but today had reminded her of why she chose this path, why she dedicated her life to justice. It wasn't for recognition or power. It was for moments like this, moments where she could help create a more just, more compassionate world. She hoped that each person who had witnessed today's events would carry the lesson forward, would remember that true strength lay in kindness and fairness. The courthouse lights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the steps where Amelia stood. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, that there would be more moments of judgment, more tests of patience. But she felt ready, anchored by her commitment to justice and her belief in the goodness of her community. She understood that change came slowly, through small actions, through every decision she made, every person she listened to with an open heart. As she turned to head home, Amelia felt a sense of peace. She knew that her strength wasn't in loud words or flashy titles. True power lay in patience, resilience, and the truth that always comes to light, even in the most unlikely places. And as long as she had that truth guiding her, she knew she would be able to face whatever challenges lay ahead.